Welcome to our second webinar discussing residential placements. Last week, we hosted journalist Kenneth Rosen, the author of Troubled, the Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Programs. Rosen discussed the experiences of 4 graduates of residential treatment programs, as well as his own experience in wilderness treatment program and a therapeutic boarding school. If you missed that webinar, you can find the video on the Forensic website under events or on the Education Law Insights podcast. This week, we're looking forward to the program, which will be more specifically focused on looking at residential placement through a special education lens. And we're excited to welcome 3 special guests. I'm Kendra Yock, and you know my colleague, Jennifer Smith. We're also pleased to have with us Dr. Ruth Kraus, Micki Moran, and our partner, John Relias. Dr. Ruth Kraus is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in Northbrook. She's hired by both school districts and families to perform evaluations, and she does many independent educational evaluations to help determine educational needs, services, and placements. Micki Moran is the founding attorney of the Child and Family Law Center, now a division of Grund and Levitt, who represents children, adolescents, and young adults in complex special education matters. And John Relias is one of our founding partners and one of the first attorneys specializing in special education law in Illinois, with several of his cases setting important precedents which continue to guide educators and attorneys today. So we have some questions ready for our panelists, but we also want to hear from you. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to send us your questions, and we will try to get to them. We also hope you will join us next week back at noon for a COVID and other hot topics update. So let's start with a general overview of students in residential placement and the role of public schools. John, can you start us off and talk to us a little bit about how issues related to residential placements have kind of changed and evolved over your years of practice?
Sure. In many instances, they're the same, and in a couple of important areas, I think there's a big change. When I first started in this practice, no one knew anything about special education because the law had just been passed. And so residential placements were really at the beginning not an issue that came across school districts' purview. But as we got into the law, as the years went by, more and more parents ended up requesting residential placements for a variety of reasons. And the big change that I have seen over the years is an increase in unilateral placements by parents, which would bypass the school process, and a residential placement will be made, and then the school district will become aware of the parent's request. And what that really means is that the school district is not able to go through the continuum of services unless there is a dispute over the residential placement, and you go to a due process hearing, which no one really wins when you go to a due process hearing. They've gotten much longer. They've gotten much more adversarial, much more actually refined with the number of witnesses and experts that testify. So that is really the main difference that I see. And it puts the school district in a bind in the sense that when there is a unilateral placement, it almost invariably means that there is no evaluation that has previously been done. As a matter of fact, the student may not even have been identified as special education, and you're jumping to the most restrictive placements. And what school districts have to do in that circumstance is to get an evaluation done. And you have the other issue that if the student is placed in a residential facility, it's usually out of state. And who does the evaluation? Where is it done? There is a case, early case, that in this circuit that is held, that the parent must cooperate with the school to do the evaluation. And that means that if a school district so determines, the placement, the evaluation has to be done in district. The school district also has the option of going out to the facility. So that, I think, is really the biggest change I have seen.
Micki, what about you? How has the practice changed through your practice?
Well, I would say there's more of a almost for unilateral placements, very common now for parents to place in non-ISB approved placements and not even have that as an idea in their head. And so sometimes the kid will already be there. And then, the school districts are, I would say the word reluctant probably doesn't capture it, to pay for a non-approved ISB placement. And I would even go so far as to say that there's been more recent school district amendments to their rules, and same with ISB, about the refusal to pay for those or to provide, to reimburse for those. So that's become really kind of a central battle in some of the cases I see that wasn't as common early on.
Well, Micki, let's give a little explanation as to the funding process and what a non-approved placement means. The State Board of Education has a list of residential facilities that are approved by them under the Governor's Purchase Care Review Board. What that means is that the state will pick up a good portion, if not a majority portion, of the costs, because if the state board approves of the placement, then the state board pays for the residential portion of the placement, assuming the funds are appropriated, which they have been by and large over the years, and at 90% or more. A non-approved placement, the state board will not pay anything for, which means that the school district is on the hook for the entire placement. And that puts the school district in a bind that unless the parent will agree to move the child, you almost have to go to a due process hearing because the stakes are financially so much higher.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
One of the things that I've also seen change over the time is just the proliferation of wilderness programs. And a lot of times parents will just place kids in the wilderness program thinking that's going to be it, and then they'll come back. But then the wilderness programs have a direct to residential pipeline, and they'll tell parents, oh no, your child shouldn't come back. They're too fragile. It's too dangerous. Put them in this program. And parents, not knowing otherwise, and not knowing the whole process about what goes on with the school districts, and because a lot of times these kids haven't been in special ed, will just go, oh, okay. And then they'll hear, oh, now the school district should pay for it. And then they'll go to the school district. And I think the wilderness programs haven't been around that long. There haven't been this many. It hasn't been that popular. So I think that's another issue that we see.
Yeah, that is an issue, but most parents know that a school district will not pay for a wilderness program. What happens after, that is the key here.
Right.
And in a lot of instances, the school districts, if a child is that fragile or has other issues and is going to a wilderness program and then to a residential placement, skipping all the interim steps, will, if the documentation is there, if the evaluation is there, as long as the student is placed in an approved facility, will write an IEP for a residential facility on the condition that ISB approves the placement. So the other change that I have seen is school districts being more amenable to actually bypassing the interim steps in circumstances where the documentation, the evaluation do establish a need for a residential placement, that there's no need or desire to take the interim steps because they will not help the student. So that, now this is not all school districts, and some of them quite honestly say, well, we haven't been given a chance to do something for the kid, but do you really want to go through all of the legal hoops if indeed there is a basis to make the residential placement? So that is another change that I have seen.
Ruth, on the resident or the wilderness programs, and I don't know if this is a good question for you or maybe Micki. One thing I've never quite understood is with residential placements, we'll get the argument they need the student in that condition with, you know, say severe mental health issues, needs consistency, needs a length of placement. But that, so I never quite needs relationship building. So I never quite understood why you took a student who would benefit from that kind of environment, but yet throw him out in the wilderness for 8 weeks before you send him to the stable environment. Like, I guess I don't understand. Is there a therapeutic theory to that makes, no, not.
Well, and I'm not an expert on wilderness programs, so I'm going to preface it with this. And I've actually seen kids who I think would benefit from wilderness programs, but not from residential. And, you know, it teaches a lot of self-sufficiency, independence. It's really good for kids' confidence in a lot of ways. I had a kid come back and say, I know how to build a fire and I know how to cook, you know, and it was like, it was a confidence builder. It depends on the program and it depends on the kid. But to say, you know, and parents will say, okay, we're sending you to wilderness without even thinking the next step is going to be residential. And they're willing to pay for the wilderness and everything. But then at the end, and a lot of times it happens over the summer. And then in the fall, they're into the residential placement and the school district didn't even know they were in wilderness. I mean, it's all of a sudden they are. And, you know, so I think that's an issue. I don't think the wilderness programs are for the really depressed kids. I mean, it's more for the kids who are more acting out and externalizers.
You've mentioned this, you know, parents maybe don't understand kind of what they're getting into when they send their kids to wilderness. And we talked some last week about the role of the educational consultant and how, you know, they kind of pick up these parents maybe even at the hospital or shortly after a hospitalization and kind of sell them on this placement is the key to solving this problem. Are there things schools or communities or pediatricians or somebody can be doing to better educate parents about what this process looks like, what supports are available, kind of what steps to take? So they're in this like crisis. How can schools better support parents through these difficult times?
Is that so I think, you know, kids come out of the hospital mainly and go to partial hospital programs. That's pretty much the step down. So it's and that's, you know, hospitals now are just stabilization 5 to 7 days. And then they go into the PHPs for maybe a month, sometimes 6 weeks. And it's at that juncture that I think really coordinating with the PHP and looking, that's a good time to get an evaluation. If there is no evaluation, that's a really good time to figure out is what is going on with this kid something that looks like it's going to be a long haul, long term, or is this something that looks like it's a single crisis that can be addressed more within the community? I mean, I think, you know, we always want to keep kids in the community and in their families whenever possible. So I think it's at that time that you really want to pour on those resources for them, that the school, maybe schools can work more closely with partial programs to really coordinate what's going to happen after the child leaves the partial program, because that's when things can get dicey.
The one issue that I think is beyond the school district's control is that parents don't come to the school district early enough to do things to get involved. Usually, not usually, but there are a lot of cases where the first time a school district will hear about a student is that he or she has been hospitalized. And sometimes it's not even a student that is enrolled in the school, but who is a resident of the district, but is attending a private or parochial school. And then the school district has no knowledge of the issues until they've all blown up. And that is really something that districts cannot control, because it's up to the parents to come to the district and give them that information. Now, I'm talking about mostly students who are not enrolled in district schools, but are residents of the district.
I think a new twist on that is we have a question in the chat about school environment, and another example of being outside the school, or now not know, is it outside or inside, is remote learning. And the question was, could we speak to the definition of school environment and whether that's changed now given remote learning and distance learning? I feel like, Micki, that we've talked about that over the course of the year. And I mean, to your point, John, about sometimes never seeing the student because they're at private or parochial. Sometimes now, I mean, there's students that we haven't seen since last March because they're in their home, but they're still your student. So I don't know, does anyone want to try to take that on how much of home now is school because of remote learning?
I've had a lot of cases where kids are not well, there's a continuum, of course, but I have a number of cases where the kids have just said, I'm not doing this. Okay, this is not for me. And so and kids with really severe disabilities, or kids who have developed a disability as a result of these events. You know, and the Department of Education said we're not relaxing, you know, idea. So I think those are still triggering child find issues. That's come up. How do you evaluate a kid who's wearing his hoodie and will only plays video games 15 hours a day on Zoom? And that's more recently, things have opened up a bit. But, you know, I had a kid who his teeth were falling out of his mouth because he hadn't left the house. This is an elementary school student in a suburb. And instead of doing something more proactive, they called DCFS on the parent. Which of course,
that's what the school district did?
Yeah, because the kid was not hygienic. Now, the problem with that is, of course, as you imagine, it didn't build a good bridge. But instead, I would have suggested that they may be offered to evaluate, or to get a psychiatric evaluation, or to do something to assist or to intervene. you know, Jen, you have you have a case with me that where the kid hasn't participated since the day one on this. And that, you know, the question is, what was the district's obligation on, you know, on how to deal with that? It wasn't exactly a mental health issue, but it might lead to a residential placement.
Yeah, I agree that I don't think we can completely, there's probably more blurring of the lines now, and it's going to be harder to argue that maladaptive behavior at home is just a home issue when the student was engaged in remote learning during that, you know. So I think that is going to, as cases percolate and they get into court, I think those are going to be hard arguments to make that's a home issue argument. And I agree that the child find issue exists. I guess where I'm not sure is the disability versus this is a normal reaction to a really bad situation. So I'm not sure we need to diagnose everyone for having a negative reaction to a lot of bad things being thrown at them. That doesn't quite seem like the right answer either, you know, and send everyone off to residential because they were upset because their whole life got taken away and they had people die. And I mean, so they're upset. That's really upsetting, you know. So I don't know that we need to be slapping labels on everyone and you know. So I'm not exactly sure how it's gonna shake out, but I'm a little bit hesitant to completely go the disability route on that. I don't know what you guys think.
I would agree with that. And I've seen kids who really fell apart on remote learning for a variety of reasons. And once they got back into the school setting, they're doing much, much better. So you can't really say because of the situation, it's a situational response. And it's more of an adjustment disorder. If you want to give it a diagnosis, it's not, you know, it's they're having difficulty adjusting to a change in situation. But then, you know, because when you think about it, well, at least from my perspective, sending kids to residential comes along with a lot of baggage for the kids, even if it's very warranted. Kids who come out of residential, and I've seen a bunch of them, are very torn between, I know they did it for my best interest, but my parents abandoned me. And I will always feel abandoned, and I'll never trust that I'm not going to be abandoned again or sent off or something because I'm such a bad person. But I know they did it for my own good. But so you know, that causes problems, sort of lifelong problems. So it's not an easy decision. It's not just like, oh, let's just send them to residential and they'll be fine.
All right, so we're talking about a lot of good issues here, and I guess speaking more to this kind of what's home versus what's school, you know, the legal standard is, you know, whether residential placement is necessary for educational purposes. And so we're always trying to draw that line about kind of what's at home and what's happening outside of school. And obviously that's really blurred now during remote learning. But I don't know if you guys want to speak any more to, you know, more traditionally, what does that look like for the kids that are, you know, having trouble at home or who are sneaking out at night or who are, you know, whatever, but when they get to school, you know, are doing okay. And what does that look like as far as residential placement or other types of interventions?
Well, typically that type of a situation would not warrant a residential placement. If a student is progressing in school grade-wise and has issues at home, acting out against parents, siblings, is out and may be engaging in behavior which involves police involvement, things like that, you can differentiate as for a residential placement on the one hand. But I do think that where the schools should go is for that type of a student, if he or she is not having social work services, that should be given, because there's obviously something wrong and you would want to address that before it gets to the point where some type of more restrictive placement is needed. Now, we're assuming what we're talking about here is a student who is on campus. And the situation we have now is so abnormal that, all the guidelines, all the rules are off the table. But I do agree with what Dr. Kraus said, that hopefully it's just a, I guess, temporary situation. But I think we're going to see a lot of issues come up when we actually reopen the schools. I know schools are reopened now, but my grandkids have the situation where they're in school and then someone in their class or homeroom tests positive for COVID, and then the entire class has to quarantine for 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever. And that disruption it's not special education, but it is a disruption. And we're going to see more of that until we can get everybody back in school.
Yeah, okay. So shifting gears a little bit and kind of speaking to some of the issues we talked about last week, what can schools look for if they are going to think about a residential placement? How do they determine what school or what placement is appropriate? What should they be looking for? Are there certain types of, certifications or therapies or educational services they should be searching for? Who should they talk to? How can they make that a better process?
Not ISB.
I think Micki should answer that first.
Yeah, Micki.
Yeah. So, I mean, I frequently get calls from school district lawyers, and I do the same. Do you know of a placement for this kid? Because really, it's such a small number of placements, and it's really, first of all, the Illinois State Board, shoot me now, but they don't visit these placements. They don't go look at them. They don't make sure that everything is fine and the education is great. They never do site visits. That has dropped off. That had dropped off years ago.
It's all a
At all.
analysis.
What? Yeah, it's a
It's all
financial
financial.
analysis. That's right.
Yeah.
It's all about the rate that they're
Yeah.
going to get, and they do give a nod to having special education certified teachers. Okay, and I suppose that they hope that the kids are getting 3 meals a day, and some therapy. But I think this is pretty low bar. So that's a problem, and I think it's important for all of us who do this work to be aware of these placements and to know what's going on with them, to really be sort of the eyes. And there was a time when school districts did visit these programs if they were going to place a kid. The director might fly out. That seems like such a quaint practice now, but that, not even because of COVID, but that did happen back in the day. You must remember that, John, where some directors would go
Yes.
look at places. Okay, they said they wouldn't send a kid that they hadn't seen, if they hadn't seen the placement first. And that just, I don't think occurs at all anymore. So I think having parents do their own due diligence, most parents do. But for school districts who don't have a sophisticated parents, it's up to them to really dig in and see what's going on with that placement, preferably to visit if possible.
And I think parents are so vulnerable, and when their kids are at the point where they need a residential, they're so vulnerable to all kinds of things, and they're in such crisis that they'll kind of, who knows how they're taking in information. But if someplace looks good, yeah, that looks fine. rather than really looking at specifically, you know, I tell parents, is there a psychiatrist on staff, a board certified child and adolescent psychiatrist who manages meds? So, I mean, one of the things that residentials can do a good job of is getting kids off of meds, kids who are on a lot of hardcore psychiatric medication that causes side effects, including mental dulling, cognitive dulling. You see slides in IQ, you see slides in focus, you see slides in just alertness. So they can get the kids off of those meds because they have the structure to do that. But you need a psychiatrist on staff to do that. Do they have licensed clinical people running the programs? Are there PhDs and LCSWs, or is it just a bunch of LPCs and MAs? You know, you want to make sure that the staff that they've hired are people who know what they're doing. So I think that's important. You don't want to put an internalizing kid in with a bunch of, you know, really externalizing kids, because it's going to scare the crap out of them, you know, and then they may very well get worse. So it's really fitting the program to the particular kid.
What about on the educational side? It seems like a lot of the programs are doing kind of virtual instruction that we've all been doing this year anyway. You know, do some of them have actual teachers and special education teachers? You know, every once in a while we get parents who, despite the crisis that's happening, still want, you know, their kid in AP statistics. And so, you know, they ask, we really need the rigorous academics too. And, you know, how should we be thinking about those issues?
Well, I think
Well, there are some schools that do have classes where kids can attend. Now, I'm not talking about the COVID period, because that throws everything really out of the window. But the interesting thing is that when a school district makes a residential placement, it accepts implicitly what educational opportunities or services the residential facility provides. The school district doesn't tell the residential facility this, and this has to be provided. It may say that this child needs these classes for credit to get a diploma, but you, the district and parent, accepts the basic structure of the educational program provided by the residential facility. So that means that you really have to know what that is and make sure that it fits the educational needs of the child.
so. Jennifer and I had a case, John, following up on that, that's important, where a kid went to a residential program, and I would say maybe you can jump in, you know what I'm talking about, Jennifer. They went to Missouri.
Okay, yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
they didn't make very much academic progress in reading and in math. So they came home after their 18th birthday, and it turns out that they were pretty much where they started from, or close to, when they went to residential 2.5 years before that academically. I mean, I'm giving a broad brush here. Would you agree with that? And, the parent said,
The parent
okay,
was
now
mad.
I'm going to sue you,
Right.
district, because my kid didn't get a FAPE at the residential program. And so now you're on the hook for comp ed for failing to do this, or extended services, even though the child met graduation requirements.
And the parent was the one who wanted that residential placement in the
Right.
first place. So sometimes I mean, this happens in all kinds of situations. You give the parent what they want, only for the parent to find out that's not what they wanted at all. So, I mean, that's the time. It's always a fine line. Do you push back in the moment, or do you let them have what they want and see that it's no great shakes, you know? But I mean, I think with respect to residential placements, the reason the student's going to residential is not to make leaps and bounds of academic progress. It should only be done to stabilize, you know, because their mental health or their disability is so unregulated in any other less restrictive placement that you must do that. But you can't expect, I mean, so the progress you want to see is probably on the regulation of that thing so they can come back. It's not going to be that they're going to go there and make leaps and bounds of educational progress. It's just hopefully they'll be in a space where they could someday make educational progress again. So it's sort of looking at it totally the wrong way, I think, if people think these are like some boarding school where you get a Harvard education if you go away. That's not what these things are.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be realistic with parents and to help them understand that all the APs in the world aren't going to matter if their child can't get regulated, and whatever it is that they're facing can't get dealt with, because they're not going to college in the situation they're in. So you really need to, you know, I've said to parents, you know, cash in the college fund and use it to pay for treatment, and then they could take out loans for college, because if you don't, they're not going to go to college. So this is, you know, there's this emphasis on they have to go to college and they have to graduate when they're 18 and go to college and everything. And it's like, you know, that's not always realistic. So
One of the key issues, Micki and I have bumped up against this, I'm sure John has, is the age of the student too. Sometimes parents see 18 coming and they're like 17 and a half, and they want you to send them to residential as some like last ditch effort. And I mean, everyone should be clear, when they're 18, the student can revoke that placement and come on home, and they make their own decisions if they haven't, if there's not a guardianship or anyways. So that tends to be, so usually we're talking about freshmen, sophomores, you know, maybe early juniors. But when you get past that, these also the placements often have an age range. And so I've had districts willing to do a transitional residential placement, but there are just no good options for that type of placement.
Following up what, as I told you when we were talking about this before, I try to look on the positive side. It could be really, there's a lot of negative about this in general, just heart-wrenching decisions for parents, schools with sort of few options. But there's a question, if you don't mind my saying, Kendra, about what can be done to optimize. We should never use that word, but optimize.
That is exactly the feedback John gave us.
Okay, right. See, I learned from John, so I eliminated that from my vocabulary. The benefit of a residential placement and to protect from regression once the placement is concluded. I would say on the first part is that one of the things that I find very common in residential placements, it's kind of like a one-way ticket. Okay, and once the kid is there, schools often bow out. They might sort of in a kind of cursory way participate in an IEP now and then, or a quarterly report, but they're not checking on the kid. They're not like monitoring it closely. So all of a sudden they're at the end of the placement, but they really haven't had any contact, any idea of what's going on. I think schools need to stay involved in like they would with a very high need kid who is in district, that it's much more, front and center. And that planning process for what comes next shouldn't come 30 days before a kid is going to be discharged from a placement. It really needs to be an ongoing process, because, a lot of times kids are coming back to what? I mean, and that hasn't been really fully thought out. So that's my 2 cents.
No, that's a great move into that topic of what does happen when the kids come back. And in the book that we talked about last week, not good stuff. It's a hard transition to make. It's hard to, even if you do develop some of those skills when you're in residential, then to come back to the environment that you left, and the challenges that that presents, and to be able to move forward. Are there things that schools can do? Or are there other supports that can be put in place to help that go a little bit more smoothly?
Well, I think one of the main issues that a school district must consider is when a student is transitioning back, do you put him back on campus or do you put him at a day school to see if the transition there is working, and from there then bring him back to the main campus? So I think that's one thing that districts should consider up front. Now, some kids really want to come back to the main campus, and if the school has a program, a special ed program that may be self-contained, maybe that's where you put them. But I think everybody has to realize that once a child is released from a residential placement, he or she is not cured, and that services are still going to be needed, and they may be fairly intensive.
And I think, it really depends. That's where that evaluation piece comes in, and you really have to know the individual kid, because for some kids, transitioning from residential, then to therapeutic, then back, it's a lot of transitions and they never quite get their feet on the ground. For other kids, it's really appropriate and they may never go back to a gen ed setting, and they may always need that therapeutic self-contained model. But I think the other things that sometimes school districts miss when they bring the kids back in, and especially young adolescents. So I'm talking about, kids who may have been in residential in 8th grade or freshman year, and then they're coming back, is just the social milieu that these kids are coming back into, because it can be very difficult. And I think there's a lot of focus on the academics and how they're going to get back in. But, stop and think, where's this kid going to eat lunch? Who's he going to eat lunch with in the cafeteria? He doesn't really know anybody. How are you going to help him integrate into the social life of the school and become, and start feeling like he or she is part of that school rather than this outsider? And I think that's something that I sat through a lot of meetings, and, I'm always like, who are they eating lunch with in the cafeteria? How are you going to get them back into the school? That's can really make it or break it for some of these kids.
And this is also for not only afterwards, but before, preventative. I think trying to identify where those things are falling apart before a kid goes to residential is, I think, really important. So asking what services can be put in place for kids, like an extended day before, so that we're scaffolding at both ends. And also, what kind of support is the kid going to need at home? Obviously, it's not the school's responsibility for transition for those services, but making sure that parents have identified a psychiatrist, a therapist, and other supports that are going to be needed. I think a more thorough plan than I rarely see that in place for kids coming out of residential. And I think that's why you have some poor outcomes, is that it's not a miracle. It's just a stop along the way.
Yeah, and I want to pick up, you talked about preventative, and we kind of promised in our intro that we would talk about alternatives and, what can we do to support kids before we're in the position that it really seems like residential might be needed. So what else in schools and communities can be done to help intervene and maybe prevent some of these placements?
So I don't, I have a lot of ideas of what can be done, how doable they would be. I don't know. But as we were talking before, I see so many breakdowns around, kids not doing their homework, and then they get behind the 8 ball, and then they start failing, and then the parents are tearing their hair out, and there's the homework battles at home. And then, there's, and then that devolves into kids getting anxious or depressed or acting out, and then you're off to the races. So even just something as simple as not all kids are able to do homework at home or outside of school. And is there a way to adjust and to be able to accommodate for that? I mean, I set IEPs where it's like, give them, 15 minutes of homework a night and see if they can do that. So being able to think maybe outside the box about some of the expectations you have with some of these kids, and then also being able to put some services in after school. I see so many kids who are like, home is my time. School can't tell me what to do. I'm not doing homework at home. They have no control over me at home. And that's their attitude. And they are not going to do a lick of work at home. So have a way to keep them in school and have them doing homework within the school day or because I really do think that a lot of the issues we see have to do with when the parents are trying to get the kids just to keep up with their homework and not fall behind. I see that a lot.
And one thing that the schools can do is to reduce the amount of homework for specific kids under the IEP. And that sometimes is easier said than done, because if the student is not in all special education courses that the special department can easily control, you have a regular ed teacher who says, well, that lowers my standards for this child and for the class, and I can't reduce the amount of homework. But reducing the amount of homework is one easy way to try to assist the child and to do some preventive actions.
Sometimes I feel like we have kids who are, say, in all honors and AP classes, and then their parents want you to waive all homework and reduce the expectations of the classes. And it's like, we have that. It's called the non-AP, whatever the normal math classes or whatever, but we don't want that. Anyways, sometimes I think if we push those, on behalf of the child, we push those issues a little harder. We're okay with, a little confrontation with the parents around the schedule is not supportive of what they need. We need to reduce it and put them in some classes that are paced, not where they're the only student paced differently in a class. That's not appropriate, but we're in a class that's appropriately paced. I don't know, but I get a lot of pushback on that, honestly.
And I'm thinking more about the kids in the sort of the regular level, not the honors, not the AP, but even those sort of basic, and they may have ADHD and they can't, and their meds wear off or they can't focus, or any of that stuff that causes some real problems for them. And there's got to be ways to accommodate for that.
I mean, if one positive thing will come out of the pandemic, I do think I've seen a lot of my clients be extremely more flexible with grading in the last year than they've ever been. And I'm wondering if some of that will be viewed as a positive that they want to continue, or if it's just going to be this year only deal. But maybe there'll be some positive lessons learned there. I don't know if you've seen that, Ruth, but truly a lot of this, there's a lot of flexibility out there, I'll say, I think.
I have seen that. I've seen that. And it's been good for some kids, and for other kids, it's just been a permission to just play video games. So it really is a mixed bag, I think. But, also to be aware of, what kids are taking. I don't know, this is a little off the residential road we're on, but, like 5 AP classes, why would a kid, who decides that, because the stress levels and developmental, appropriateness of that, just making sure that kids can be reasonable about how much stress they're taking on. Because I think you see them breaking under the stress. And they don't always, and these really high achieving kids, you don't always see it until they're in the hospital. So when you say, how do you, you know, avoid, how do you intervene early? Think about, well, maybe, you know, 5 AP classes isn't appropriate for any kid. So limit it, you know?
One issue we didn't touch on, which is it's a significant part of my practice, so I think it's important, are kids with intellectual disability, autism, or developmental disorders that have exhibited really significant behavioral problems, either at school or at home. Those kids are a significant part of the work I do in some residential placement. It's not always the troubled adolescent from the suburbs. It's the kid who bangs his head against the floor until he has concussion. And that, you know, schools have no idea what to do with that. And it hasn't been made better. And again, there are very few residential placements that deal with that. But it is something that I think presents itself very differently. And then the kids we've been talking about most of this hour, but I do want to make that a point that that is certainly a band of kids that I think we're all dealing with, which I think there's less resistance to residential for that. There seems to be a more ability to have a consensus with the parents, and if anything, the parents may be more reluctant to place a kid residentially in those sorts of circumstances, or it's a slower process because, you know, there is a whole sort of issue around the disability. But that is, and there are a number of ISB placements that deal with that. So, but
That's sort of the impression I have, that historically, that, you know, ideas saying residential placement for educational purposes, that those were the students that were kind of in mind, as opposed to the troubled teen kind of profile that we've been talking about. And I guess even for those kids, are there other, you know, we had a question last week about in-home support or parent counseling or parent, you know, coaching, and kind of, can that be effective? At what point is it the school's responsibility versus the parent's responsibility to handle those sorts of things? What have been your experiences with those sorts of supports?
Well, you know, you have the in-home ABA supports for kids, which, you know, depending on the issue and what they're working on, can be effective. But I think when you have a very out of control kid who has a developmental disability, and the out of control and the dysregulation is a piece of the developmental disability, to be really aware of safety issues too. And I think what Micki said, it strikes such a chord with me, because I've seen kids who have really been, you know, presenting a danger to their parents, and who've really beat up their mothers, and really are, you know, presenting significant dangers to family members, and they're really reluctant to place them. The parents don't want them placed residentially for whatever reason. And I think helping schools, you know, recognize that, and helping them help the parents come to terms with the fact that, yeah, this kid probably does need to be placed residentially. When a kid's that out of control, I'm not sure there's any at-home supports. That's putting a lot on parents, you know, that they didn't sign up for that. You know?
Those are issues that school districts, I think, find easier to go to residential, because that student who is out of control to that extent is also going to exhibit that at school, because he or she simply can't control it. And school districts are willing to do that, but I think everybody who has spoken on this today is correct that that is one where I find the parents are more reluctant. They do not want the child, adolescent, out of the home, as opposed to other parents that say, I've had it. You know, those parents that we're now talking about, I don't think they say I've had it. They want to keep trying even though they may know that it's really not working.
Seen some teams demonstrate a lot of empathy and try to like offer to communicate to the child that they were the one that decided, like kind of throw themselves between the parent and the child to try to preserve that relationship, so the child doesn't feel sent away by their parents, because that's just too much. So anyways, I don't know if that helps on ultimately, but I've seen some good administrators make that attempt, and I've thought that appeared to be a good practice for those situations where the parent was struggling so mightily.
And also letting the parent know that all that can be done has been done, like through the school, and really that we've tried this, we've tried that, we've done all the interventions that we can creatively manage, and it still isn't working. And one of the discussions I have is that we're trying to get kids ready, regardless of their level of disability, for what comes after school or over at 22. So if a kid's very aggressive, I'm speaking of the group we just are talking about, the intellectual disability with some dysregulation, whether it be autism or a whole variety of things, there's not just one thing. Those kids are going to be impossible to place in adult life. Their options for the parents are going to be very, very limited. And unless those things get addressed front and center. So sometimes that helps parents understand that they have to be forward looking about trying to do the right thing.
I think a lot of them are struggling with so much guilt
Yes.
that it's hard for them to think beyond and to realize that that there's nothing else they can do. They keep feeling like, well, if I did this and if I did that and did that, it would be better. And just absolving them of the guilt is helpful.
Well, as we get close to 1, I'm hoping we can wrap up with some positive takeaways. Are there positive trends you're seeing, or other, hopeful solutions? Anybody?
I think the issue is manageable, but what it's going to take is the continued financial support from ISBE, because that is the key to whether or not these residential placements, and we've talked for an hour about them like they occur all the time, and I don't think that's really the case, that the number is fairly low considering the entire population. So I think that's a good trend. I also think that the strengthening of day schools, both public and private, is a good alternative in a lot of cases. And I don't know how COVID has, the COVID effect on day schools has been a great negative, but the strength in having day schools as an alternative is another important trend and factor.
And I also think that the whole move, and I see this in a lot of high schools around where I work, but I don't know how widespread it is, but to destigmatize mental illness, and just in the general population, just the growing awareness of, depression, anxiety, all of the things that kids face, and not making it something that needs to be hidden. That, if you're struggling, that it doesn't mean that you're damaged, or there's, you're a bad person. And so the kids understanding that they can reach out and have more resources in the school, I think is helpful.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I know we're 1 minute away, but I can't close without thanking everyone for including me in this webinar. It was really fun.
Well, thank you both. This was, and John, this was.
Yeah, John, I haven't seen John in a while.
That's true, Micki. I'm trying to wind down.
I know, I heard that, and we missed our annual dinner this year.
Dinner. Yes, we'll do it this year.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. It's good to see everybody.
Thank you. And thank you for including me as well.
Take care.
Thank you all so much. Everybody have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.